Medieval peasant women went through experiences that most people don't know about. They weren't discussed in school, mentioned in books, or even in those creepy bedtime stories meant to scare kids. Their lives were tough, unforgiving, and full of rules they never agreed to. So what was life really like for them? Let's start at sunrise, because that's when their day began, whether they were ready for it or not. Medieval peasant women lived according to the sun. They woke up before dawn to get the fire going, starting it from barely glowing embers. If you think your morning routine is tough, try making breakfast when you literally have to create fire first. Everything was made from scratch in smoky one-room homes that didn't have chimneys, so the air was thick with smoke. Water wasn't just a simple tap away. It meant carrying heavy wooden buckets from wells or rivers multiple times a day. Some women had to walk long distances just to fetch clean drinking water. The garden was another important task. Vegetables like onions, leeks, and cabbage needed constant attention, while animals needed to be fed and kept an eye on. Spinning wool into thread was a never-ending job, alongside weaving cloth and mending clothes. Nothing went to waste. If it could be repaired, it would be. On top of that, women made candles and soap using animal fat and dangerous chemicals, all without protective gear. These women were running personal manufacturing businesses, except they weren't getting paid and there were no vacation days. Children were always around, following their mothers because there were no TVs or tablets to keep them occupied. Seasonal farm work meant everyone had to pitch in, especially during harvest, when women worked alongside men to cut grain and prepare food for the winter. There was no real rest during the day. Work started at sunrise and didn't stop until sunset. Even when women were sitting briefly to spin thread, there was always something else to do. True relaxation only came after dark, when work became impossible due to the lack of light. The physical demands of daily life were enormous. Medieval women developed strong muscles from all the manual labor, but this came with frequent injuries and chronic pain. Their hands were often permanently stained from handling rough materials and dyes. Most of them probably went to bed exhausted, but at least they didn't have to worry about checking their phones to keep them awake at night. This unrelenting schedule lasted all year, with little variation except for religious holidays when work was forbidden. But all of this was just part of a much larger system that shaped every aspect of a woman's life. Love and romance had little to do with medieval peasant marriages, which were more like business contracts than anything else. Parents arranged marriages based on land ownership, labor needs, and family alliances. A woman's value was often measured in chickens, cooking pots, and other household items. This might sound ridiculous, but it was a harsh reality for families who desperately needed these resources. The dowry system meant families had to prepare their daughters for marriage years in advance, usually by gathering livestock, farming tools, cooking pots, or grain. Many women left their childhood homes once they married, adjusting to new routines and new neighbors. Legal authority was entirely one-sided, with husbands holding power over every aspect of their wives' lives. Women couldn't own property, make major decisions, or leave the house for extended periods without permission. Anything a woman brought into the marriage, like land or valuable items, automatically became her husband's property. Inheritance laws typically excluded women unless they became widows. Financial planning for medieval women basically boiled down to hoping their husbands lived long enough to provide security, but not so long that they never inherited anything. Divorce or separation was almost impossible. The Catholic Church forbade divorce except in very rare cases, and annulments were costly legal processes that most peasants couldn't afford. Physical discipline of wives was legal and sometimes even expected. Economic dependence reinforced these power imbalances. Women couldn't own businesses or accumulate wealth independently, so they had to rely entirely on their husbands for financial security. This made it essential for women to create their own support networks, like medieval group therapy, but with more spinning wheels. The emotional realities of these marriages varied. Some couples developed real affection over time, while others remained distant, trapped in systems that didn't allow separation. Religious teachings only reinforced these structures, presenting female submission as divinely ordained. Priests regularly preached about a wife's duty to obey her husband, making any challenges to the inequality spiritually dangerous. These power structures weren't just personal, they extended into every practical aspect of survival, including the most basic necessity of all: food.
Medieval kitchens were not like what we imagine today. Instead of modern stoves, peasant kitchens operated like makeshift outdoor camping setups, with large hearths serving as the center of all cooking. These kitchens were smoky, filled with the haze from constant fires. Proper chimneys were a luxury, so cooks worked in these eye-watering conditions, probably making health inspectors today run for the hills. The daily diet revolved around barley bread, dense, dark, and often gritty from poorly ground grain. If you thought about medieval bread as a product, it was the opposite of Wonder Bread. It could probably be used to patch up the house if needed. Wheat, the higher quality grain, was reserved for the wealthy. Pottage, a thick stew made from whatever grains, vegetables, and scraps were available, formed the backbone of most meals. It was a one-pot dish that could stretch small amounts of food to feed large families. But the nutritional value of these stews varied significantly, depending on what ingredients were at hand. Meat, on the other hand, was a rare treat. It appeared mostly during special occasions. A pig might be slaughtered once a year, providing salt pork to last for months, and peasants treated meat much like we treat expensive wine today, saving it for the rare occasions when it could be truly appreciated. Preservation techniques were crucial for surviving the winter. Women spent autumn in a frenzy, preserving food for the long months ahead. They salted fish, dried fruits, and pickled vegetables, though the flavors of preserved foods were often strong and sour. Water was another challenge. Its quality posed constant health risks, so people mostly drank weak ale. Medieval people essentially lived on beer as their primary beverage, but the ale was so weak it barely qualified as alcoholic. Feeding a large family was another struggle. With households often containing 6 to 10 people, one-pot meals were a necessity for efficiency. But this meant variety was limited, and portion sizes were often a point of contention. Winter and early spring were particularly tough, as food stores ran low and new crops hadn't yet ripened. These were the hunger months. Famine was a frequent threat, often caused by poor weather or warfare that disrupted farming. The medieval calendar was filled with food restrictions, sometimes enforced by the church, with the idea that breaking these rules could condemn you to hell, not just ruin your diet. But beyond food struggles, women faced even more challenges, especially around pregnancy and childbirth. Being pregnant was essentially a 9-month countdown to a potentially life-threatening event. Women went into labor with little more than hope and herbal remedies. Medieval pregnancy advice came from sources that were just as reliable as some modern internet forums, just with fewer emojis and more talk about evil spirits. When labor began, women gave birth at home, surrounded by female relatives and local midwives, who were usually trained through experience rather than formal medical knowledge. These midwives didn't understand basic hygiene, anatomy, or proper medical procedures, and infections were common and often deadly. Pain relief consisted mainly of herbal teas, which didn't do much to ease the agony. Women mostly had to endure the pain of labor, praying for a quick delivery. The mortality rate for newborns was shockingly high. About 1 in 3 children died before reaching the age of 5. This constant loss of children hardened medieval parents, particularly mothers who had to steel themselves against the pain of burying child after child. Breastfeeding was an essential part of life, often lasting well over a year. Families didn't have safe alternatives, so it was the natural form of birth control, spacing out pregnancies a little further apart. But it also meant women spent the majority of their adult years either pregnant or nursing. Medieval maternity leave was practically non-existent. Most women returned to their household duties within days of giving birth, carrying out physically demanding tasks while their bodies were still recovering. Many women had 6 or 8 children over their lifetime, and the constant strain of repeated pregnancies, combined with poor nutrition and heavy manual labor, left them exhausted. Their bodies prematurely aged. Complications during childbirth were frequent and often fatal for both mothers and babies. The maternal mortality rate was so high that many women wrote wills before giving birth, preparing for the possibility that they might not survive the experience. Caring for sick children relied on herbal remedies which sometimes worked, but often didn't. Many childhood diseases that are easily treatable today took young lives regularly, leaving mothers feeling helpless as they watched their children suffer. Beyond the physical and emotional toll, women's survival also depended on an entirely different set of skills. Medieval peasant women were multi-skilled entrepreneurs, managing complex economic activities that kept their families alive. They were running medieval startups from their homes, except they weren't seeking venture capital, they were just trying to avoid starvation. One of the most profitable skills women could develop was brewing. Those who mastered brewing techniques could sell surplus ale to their neighbors, earning much-needed coins and gaining some degree of economic independence. Brewing required a deep understanding of fermentation, timing, ingredient ratios, and quality control skills that would impress even modern craft brewers. Women who owned cows or goats could convert excess milk into cheese, which could be stored for months, traded with neighbors, or sold at local markets. The process of making cheese required precision, temperature control, and aging techniques that took years to perfect. Meanwhile, textile production consumed enormous amounts of time but generated crucial household necessities and potential income. Spinning wool into thread was a constant task, and women would spin while doing everything else, walking, talking, supervising children, and even while sitting down for a brief rest. Weaving cloth also required skill and equipment. Looms were expensive and took up a lot of space in small homes, so only women who could afford them were able to produce fabric for both their families and for trade. The quality of the woven cloth determined its value in the market, and experienced weavers could command higher prices for their goods. Local markets were a significant part of medieval life, and they were often the only time peasant women ventured beyond their own neighborhoods. Market days were where women could sell surplus food, crafts, and other services. These markets were like early versions of farmers' markets, though there was a lot of bartering involved and the social dynamics were far more complex. For some women, these markets were rare opportunities to earn wages independently of their husband's agricultural labor.
In addition to market activities, some women took on specialized roles within their communities. They became midwives, washerwomen, or seamstresses for wealthier families. These roles required advanced skills and often involved traveling from household to household. This provided rare opportunities to earn wages independent of their husbands, offering a small degree of autonomy. For many women, however, most of their work was done at home, managing everything from kitchen repairs to building improvements. Tool maintenance and home repairs fell largely to women, especially when their husbands were busy with field work. When it came to seasonal farm work, women participated fully during crucial periods like planting and harvest. During harvest, they worked alongside men, cutting grain, binding sheaves, and gathering crops. The speed and endurance they displayed during these critical weeks were vital in determining whether families would have enough to eat throughout the winter months. Animal husbandry was another responsibility largely handled by women. They fed the chickens, milked cows, tended to pigs, and managed the breeding schedules for livestock. Understanding animal behavior, nutrition, and health problems was key to maintaining the sources of protein and draft animals that families depended on. Food preservation in the medieval world was a high-stakes game. Women had to be meticulous, as failing to preserve enough food could lead to starvation. There were no instruction manuals, just years of passed-down knowledge. They had to know exactly when fruits were ready for drying, how much salt was needed for curing meat, and which vegetables stored best for the winter. Small-scale manufacturing within the home also became a part of the job. Women produced candles, soap, and simple tools, all of which could be traded or sold to earn much-needed resources. Even though women were doing so much, their labor often went unrecognized. They were running households and managing essential tasks, yet these activities were viewed as an extension of their domestic duties rather than skilled economic activities deserving of compensation or respect. Economic pressures were a constant, but they weren't the only authority women had to deal with. The Catholic Church had enormous control over the lives of medieval women, influencing not just their actions, but their very thoughts. The Church held women under constant moral surveillance. Religious teachings painted women as morally inferior and spiritually dangerous. The story of Eve's original sin provided justification for the idea that women were naturally inclined toward evil and thus needed strict guidance from male authorities. Priests would often preach about a wife's duty to obey her husband, reinforcing the power dynamics of marriage. Women's behavior was constantly scrutinized, and confession became a tool for monitoring everything from sexual conduct to anger or disobedience. There were even rules on when married couples could engage in intimate relations, with women expected to submit to their husband's desires, all while maintaining spiritual purity, a contradictory and anxiety-inducing requirement. Modesty was enforced beyond clothing, with women expected to speak softly, avoid laughter, and keep their eyes cast downward in public. This societal pressure meant that medieval women had to be cheerful, obedient, and self-sacrificing at all times, an impossible standard that led to constant internal conflict. On top of this, there were charitable obligations. Women were expected to donate food, candles, or labor to the church, even when they were struggling themselves. They often had to sacrifice resources, sometimes taking food from their own children to meet these religious expectations. The most extreme form of religious control came in the form of witchcraft accusations. Women who showed any independence, medical knowledge, or unconventional behavior were often labeled as witches, facing harsh persecution. The fear of being accused of witchcraft was a constant source of anxiety, especially for women who were simply trying to survive and care for their families. Convent life offered an alternative to marriage, but it was mostly available to wealthier women whose families could provide the necessary dowries. Peasant women rarely had the opportunity to join convents, so they were stuck in a system that offered little in the way of escape. Despite the church's overwhelming influence, women still found ways to connect with one another, creating their own forms of support and solidarity. Medieval peasant women developed intricate social networks that were lifelines during times of crisis and sources of relief during moments of rare relaxation. These networks were like medieval versions of social media, except instead of status updates, women shared survival tips while hauling water from wells. Wells were gathering spots, not just for water, but for exchanging gossip, news, and practical advice. Market days, too, were key moments for socializing and forming business relationships. Women used these days as opportunities to travel beyond their neighborhoods, where they could interact with other women, share knowledge, and make essential connections. Spinning circles were another example of this social networking. These groups of women would gather to spin thread while sharing stories, songs, and jokes. It made the work easier and helped women form deeper bonds. Gossip in these circles acted as the original news network. No journalists, just women with excellent memories and strong opinions. But as with any social network, things could turn sour. Competition over resources like land, food, or even children could lead to long-lasting disputes. Medieval justice was essentially community-driven, where everyone knew everyone else's business and any conflicts were put on display for all to see. Despite the pressures, women still found ways to maintain their mental health. Humor and storytelling became essential for coping with the stress of daily life. These shared moments of laughter and camaraderie helped them deal with the crushing weight of their existence. In the later years of their lives, elderly women who could no longer manage physical tasks became the keepers of wisdom in their families and villages. They were the ones who had survived it all: the pregnancies, the childbirths, the endless work, and now they were valued for their knowledge. They became crucial advisors, passing down information about herbal remedies, cooking techniques, weather patterns, and survival strategies. Though their bodies were often worn out by the years of harsh labor, their minds and experience were invaluable. Medieval retirement plans didn't exist, so elderly women relied on their children to remember everything they had done for them over the years. Financial security wasn't something that medieval women could count on. The role of knowledge keeper became vital for these women as they stored generations of survival knowledge in a world where most people couldn't read or write. When it came to death, medieval women were no strangers to it. Life was fragile, and death could come quickly from disease, accidents, or violence. Women often made informal arrangements for their belongings and children while still in good health. Burial practices were simple, and many graves went unmarked and were forgotten. But the legacy of medieval peasant women lived on through the skills they passed down to their daughters and the survival knowledge they shared with their families. Their contributions, though rarely recorded by the male-dominated chroniclers of history, were monumental. When a medieval grandmother passed, it was like losing an entire library, except the books had never been written down and the librarian took all the knowledge with her. Despite the harsh realities of medieval life, the resilience and determination of these women laid the foundation for the generations that followed. They endured immense hardship, but their strength, wisdom, and contributions helped keep entire communities alive through the darkest of times.